What if Tegan and Sara played epic doom metal? That's the question we'll be asking ourselves on this week's slightly spooky What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name is Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If videos on my YouTube channel. The idea of these videos is that each week I pick a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have around in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. So, in honour of it being Halloween week, the song I picked this week was Walking with a Ghost by Tegan and Sara, and I tried to reimagine that as an epic doom metal song, so if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. Tegan and Sara were back in mind for me recently because I finally managed to catch up on the TV show High School, which is the televised adaptation of their memoir of their teenage years, which came out on Amazon Prime a little while ago. It was directed by Clea Duvall, which is fantastic, by the way. Sadly, appears to have just stopped after one series, leaving a big cliffhanger and lots of unresolved threads, but well worth a watch nonetheless. It just brought them back to mind. They're not a band I've ever been a huge fan of, but I've always really enjoyed the bits that I've heard. And I do know a lot of people for whom they've been a really important act, so it was cool to be reminded of them and then go back and listen to some stuff again. If, for whatever reason, you're not familiar with them, Tegan and Sara Quinn are identical twin sisters from Calgary in Canada, who started playing music in the mid-90s, kind of right in the midst of that kind of alternative rock revolution. Certainly according to the TV show, although they were both fans of a bunch of the music at the time, Green Day and the Smashing Pumpkins and what have you, I don't think either of them particularly played music until they were tasked with clearing up the basement at their house and came across their mum's partner's acoustic guitar and decided to attempt to play it and discovered that they actually just had a certain amount of talent for playing and started writing their own songs as teenagers. And they quite quickly, I think, developed an idiosyncratic, unique style, possibly partly just because of that sort of quite insular twin relationship. I think sometimes twins kind of rely so much on each other that they influence each other more than outside forces, if you know what I mean. For the most part, they've always written separately from each other. They're not generally a songwriting team, but they still have some quite distinct stylistic traits that they both share. Just this way of putting songs together that makes them quite unusual. The songs are quite often deceptive in their simplicity. They'll just have 2 or 3 hooks that kind of repeat round, circle back on themselves, which is the kind of thing that if you did it poorly, it could get boring very quickly, but they tend to A, fashion extremely good hooks that are very satisfying that you want to keep hearing again, and B, they also have a knack of switching things up, so you think you know the familiar bit that's coming around, but then they'll change something, either change the accompaniment or change something in the hook just to keep it interesting, keep the listener on their toes. And it's a really interesting way of doing things. They've both got really distinctive voices as well, quite unlike anyone else in pop, and tend to be produced in a really distinctive style that just kind of places those voices really up front in the mix, generally with a very direct sort of dry sound as well, so it's super in your face and very striking indeed. So yeah, they started, as I say, in their mid-teens, in the mid-90s, just playing as a duo, gathered some attention, managed to get a full band together and started releasing records towards the end of that decade. Both of them are queer, which it's probably harder for younger people to appreciate nowadays what that was kind of like for an artist trying to establish themselves back in the mid to late 90s. but there really was so little representation in those days. And I've watched interviews with Tegan Sara where they're talking about how a lot of those early years were a constant fight to sort of be able to authentically present themselves, while managers and people from record companies were trying to force them into pigeonholes, trying to dress them differently, trying to present them differently. But they really dug their heels in, fought hard to just be able to be who they actually were on stage and in the public eye. And I think that makes them so important, really. There must be just a whole generation, or probably several generations by now, of queer musicians and female musicians who saw their example and realised that they didn't have to play these industry games. It was possible to be a woman in the music industry, be a queer woman in the music industry, and not have to hide that, not have to dress up as someone you're not, and to be able to express that in your songs as well. So I think they were definitely very, very important and continue to be very important in that respect. Plus the songs are really good. They've got, as I say, this unique style, great indie pop with kind of a punky attitude, some cool kind of quirky new wavy edges as they went on, a bit more edges of electronica creeping in there as well. Always something interesting to listen to, definitely worth checking out if they've not popped up on your radar at any point. And Walking with a Ghost was one of the first songs I ever heard by them. That album, and So Jealous that it's from, was their big kind of breakthrough back in the early 2000s, and I've always loved that song. So when I was casting around for something moderately spooky sounding, at least in terms of its title, to use as a Halloween track, I was very happy to remember that and think, oh cool, I could do something with that. So I guess the next stage was just figuring out what to do with that song, and as luck would have it, I'd also just recently watched a little YouTube documentary. Can't remember the guy's name who does them. He does little documentaries on a bunch of different styles of music, and they're always pretty interesting. So if I can find it, I'll place the link down in the description. But I was just watching that because it's a style of music that, although I've been listening to metal for decades, never really investigated the whole doom metal thing. As I was discussing in last week's video, I've been a long time Sabbath fan. I think knowing that doom metal was very heavily Sabbath influenced, I think maybe I always just thought, I've already got Sabbath, I don't need a bunch of other bands that sound like them. But watching this documentary made me appreciate a bit more the depth and the expansiveness of the doom metal scene and all the kind of different strands of it and things, and made me feel like I probably did need to check that out a little bit more. So I've been having fun investigating a bit of that over the last couple of months. So I guess the basic idea of doom metal goes back into the 70s. As I said last week, Sabbath influenced every single metal band that's ever existed, whether they know it or not. Most of the bands who were forming that metal sound throughout the 1970s were obviously influenced by Sabbath, but they were drawing from other things too, taking in what Deep Purple were doing, what Zeppelin had been doing, assorted other things, and developing their own strands of this music. I think what the early doom metal bands really wanted to do was particularly focus in on the heaviest and gloomiest aspects of that Sabbath sound, those dark, pummeling heavy riffs, that relentlessly gloomy atmosphere that you get in songs like, obviously, the title track of the eponymous debut album, or Into the Void, Iron Man, those bleakest, most pounding, heaviest Sabbath songs. Most of the doom metal bands that did start back then didn't really start to emerge on record until the 80s, for whatever reason. But around that turn of the decade, you do start to see some records emerging by some of those early bands, and there's some great stuff. One of the few bands in that scene that I had heard a little bit of before, because I've got some tracks by them on an old SST record sampler, was St. Vitus, who were great. US band who play this kind of very, very raw kind of Sabbath throwback metal with some punky aesthetics to the production as well, which makes it really exciting. In a similar vein, there was the Obsessed from Washington DC, who were, as well as being really influential in metal circles, were also a massive influence on a bunch of the DC hardcore bands who emerged during the 80s too. But then there were similar scenes springing up all over the rest of the world as well. So in the UK, you have bands like Witchfinder General, for instance, who generally considered to be part of the new wave of British heavy metal, but very much much more on the Black Sabbath sounding side of things there. Over in Sweden, you have Candlemass, who played a particularly dramatic, spectacular form of this new sound, which gets christened epic doom metal. So I think all these different bands in different areas were just, as far as they're aware, playing metal, but then people start to notice the stylistic similarities between them and they get grouped together, and then people christen the genre doom metal. And as that goes on, then you start to see different strands of it emerging, and you get all these exciting little subgenres of it developing. So, as I say, Candlemass, I mean, they basically christened their own strand of it by calling their first album Epicus Doomicus Metallicus. So you get a few people following them down that route. But you also get other bands who want to slow things down even more and make them even more morbid, and then you get the whole funeral doom scene. There are bands who, instead of having the more sung vocals, want to combine the doom metal thing with the emerging death metal movement, so you get death doom. There are bands who want to lean more into the satanic side of things and combine doom metal with the emerging black metal scene, so you get the blackened doom thing, which combines the slow pace and the heaviness with the screechy vocals and the deep satanic lore that goes with it. So all kinds of stuff. So there's an awful lot to explore there. In my couple of months of just dipping into it occasionally, I've only kind of very, very barely scratched the surface. But there's definitely some exciting stuff, and I'll continue to keep checking some more of that out, especially more contemporary doom bands with female singers, because that's something that I was trying to listen to in order to figure out how I was going to shape this track around Tegan Sara's vocals. So I did have a little hunt around and try and find some bands that fit the bill for that. Found Windhand, who I thought were really impressive. Definitely enjoyed listening to some of that stuff. And a couple of others. Thor's Hammer, their 1994 demo had a decent listen to as well, which has some great stuff on, and a few others. But if you've got any other stuff kind of in that vein that anyone knows, do let me know, because I was enjoying delving into some of that. But yeah, anyway, that leads me up to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in my alternative timeline, most things are the same, but back in the mid-90s, 1994, 95, whatever year it would have been, Tegan and Sara have been tasked with clearing out the basement, as they were in our own timeline. But this time, instead of finding their mother's boyfriend's acoustic guitar, they actually uncover a little stash of his possessions, including a Gibson SG, an orange half-stack amplifier, and also a copy of Candlemass's Epicus Doomicus Metallicus. So they start off by just putting on this curious-looking LP that they've never heard of before, and are immediately just absolutely awestruck by this epic, crushingly heavy metal, the likes of which they've never heard before. And pretty soon they've got the guitar plugged in and they're taking turns to just try and figure out how to play these riffs on the guitar. And then we fast forward to the early 2000s, and we see that by now they've got a full band, they're established, they've released a few independent albums, and their newest release is headed by the single Walking with a Ghost, and it proves to be their major breakthrough with this huge, epic doom metal sound that they've established for themselves, and it helps to put them at the forefront of a whole new wave of queer doom metal bands that emerges in their wake. Which, I think would be a pretty cool thing to happen. So, in attempting to turn Walking with the Ghost into a doom metal track, first step as ever is just taking the isolated vocals and dropping them into GarageBand, syncing them up to the grid. I wanted then to slow everything way down, because the original is quite upbeat, quite kind of punchy, and I wanted this to be a real slow plod, that kind of Tyrannosaurus Rex slowly kind of pounding along feel that you get from some of these doom metal things. So got that tempo set nice and slow. Next step was putting some drums on, picked the heaviest sounding kit I could find on GarageBand, and tried to keep things pretty simple for the most part, getting a little bit more elaborate as the track develops. So a lot of it is just super simple, super minimal, just weighty playing. And then as we go along, I bring in a few double kicks and some more elaborate fills. Added some bass, starting off with just a kind of a clean but fairly fat sound with a lot of low end, and then partway through, just to thicken things up even more, I kick on a fuzz pedal just for even more low end growl. Note wise, it's not doing anything fancy at all, it's just doubling the guitar riff, sometimes an octave down, sometimes actually in unison, because the guitars are really down-tuned as well. But it's just there, growling along and providing that underpinning that we need. Guitar-wise, I've got 4 electric guitars on there, 2 rhythms, panned left and right as I normally would, and they're tuned down to, I can't even remember how far I tuned them down. It's quite down-tuned, so basically wrote a couple of riffs. The song itself is only really 2 sections that just revolve around with different things happening in the arrangement on the original, so I just did the same here. Revolve those two sections around with those riffs, but just adding more elements as we went along to keep it getting more and more intense as we go along. So I've got those 2 guitars just playing these riffs with a big nasty fuzzy sound on both of them. Then I've got a 3rd electric guitar that comes in partway through, playing an octave thing over the riffs, providing a little bit of extra harmony and just thickening the sound out even more. And then over the out chorus I bring in some lead as well, so just a bit of a solo guitar twiddle to kind of round the song out. Then I decided to make things a bit more epic than they already were. I'd have a bit of a dramatic acoustic guitar intro too, so I've got 2 acoustic guitars that come in before everything else really kicks in, just playing a little simple arpeggiated thing in harmony with one another, just for a few bars, and then you get the feedback and then everything hits. And then those crop up again when we drop everything out later in the song before we crank into that final chorus. And then just to try and make things even more epic, I decided I'd add a few more elements, some keyboards and a couple of bits. So I've got some synth strings that come in, playing really, really simple lines, but just adding more harmony again, creating that kind of mournful, wistful feel that you get in some of these doomy tracks. And then a bit further along, I also bring in a mellotron choir, which I think always sounds really spooky and evocative. So just these sort of slightly ghostly recordings of choral voices just eyeing away there. And as a final touch, I went for the tubular bells from the BBC Symphony Orchestra set from Spitfire Audio, just to add that doomy tolling bell feel, which, you know, you can't go far wrong. Sabbath knew it back in 1970, and it's never gone far wrong ever since. If you want things to sound doomy and mournful, clang a bell somewhere in the background. So got that happening as well. And then for the video, as usual, started by finding some old footage of Tegan Sara playing the song, got that synced up to the track. And then, of course, because their band don't look particularly metal, I decided we needed a different backing band to fulfill that role. So found some great old footage of Candlemass. So we've got Candlemass coming in as Tegan and Sara's backing band there. And then just to up the spooky Halloween vibes, I intercut all of that with clips from an assortment of ancient silent horror movies. So there's all kinds of spooky goings on in grainy black and white. So I made the performance clips in grainy black and white as well, just so it feels a bit more of a piece. And as a final touch, as usual, mocked up a few concert posters as well. With Tegan and Sara, like, helpfully, there's a pre-existing t-shirt with a Tegan and Sara metal logo design, so I took that logo and inserted it into various doomy metal lineups to just suggest that they're there and an active part of that scene. So I hope you enjoyed this one. As I say, I've been a fan of that song for like 20 odd years now, and I've been enjoying discovering the doom metal genre, so it was very enjoyable for me to just try and put those two together and try and get a bit of a handle on what goes into making a suitably doomy metal track. So hopefully you had as much fun with that as I did. If you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe and let me know down in the comments as well. I always appreciate your feedback. If there's anything else you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any artists or genres or songs you'd like me to check out, do let me know as well. Your suggestions are always welcome. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week. So thanks very much indeed for watching, and I hope to see you next time.